it's good that we've tried this option as well. So at least we know there's a bit of a backup, which definitely tends to work. When we have students coming in from other countries, in particular Africa and Far East, wherein the internet connectivity sometimes is an issue. So what they do is, rather than have the voice and the video enabled, they basically call in through the phone. And what we do is we mail the presentation to them so that they have it in front of them and they're able to just have a voice call with us as against a video voice. So so far so good. So let's do a quick catch up in terms of what we've done. I know that you've completed your first unit, which is to do with the unit 3.23, how businesses operate, and you've done quite well, obviously, on that. So you got your final assignment. It's been obviously judged at merit mark. So that's a good start, obviously, with the first unit. And now we know that we've covered the second unit as well, which is Principles of Marketing and Techniques 3.24. And that's the one that I believe you're currently working on in terms of your assignment.
Right, that's true.
Yeah. Now, one quick feedback that I have, in terms of when you're doing the assignment, is that you do not need to do the full assignment as a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is something which I did mention to you in the written feedback sent across. So my suggestion would be when you do the next assignment, which is the unit 3.24, that suggestion would be to look at doing a mix of reading the assignment tasks in the Word document. And there are places where it says you need to do an activity, which is basically a Word document. And in some places, it'll ask you to do a presentation or design a presentation pack. That would mean that you're basically doing that activity or task as a presentation.
Right.
So your portfolio will actually be a combination of a Word document, which is a bit of essay style kind of an activity that you've done. And then the other one would be primarily, your PowerPoint presentation.
Right, okay.
Okay, now we're going to start the third unit, which is basically, the communication skills in business. And here, what I'm trying to look at primarily is looking at covering this in about three sessions. So today we are looking at covering learning outcome 1. But before we start, what I'm going to do is obviously, showcase a small video. This is going to be a bit of an experimentation again, just to see, I know you'll be able to hear it and see it on the screen. There is a prominent, I'm just going to unshare the screen for a second just to play the video. And this is from a movie clip, which essentially, talks about verbal, non-verbal communication skills. So it's something I'm going to play that in front of you in a second. Just to get you started with understanding, the types of skills that we have in communication and why is communication very important.
Right.
Okay. Okay, here we go. Able to see my screen now? Right, okay, that's fine. It's just a video clip that I'm going to play now, which basically talks about a bit of an introduction to non-verbal communication.
Right, okay.
Good morning, sir. What can I get started for you today?
Are you able to hear and see this together?
Yeah, I can do it, yeah.
Okay, that's great.
Hi. All right. 3:15. Would you care for a pastry? Nope. Mocha. 3 mocha lattes. Double chocolate chip muffin. Yum. definition. Abraham Lincoln. Me. Gun. Shoot. 3 shots. All right. So, 3 lattes, 3 mochas, double chocolate chip muffin, and 3 shots. No assassinations. Oh, and 3 Paul McCartney CDs. It's gonna be 6812.
Right, that was one of the videos basically showing you some non-verbal communication. And what we want to be able to do is look at this picture. Now, when you look at this particular picture, we see, different types of people with different types of, standing postures. And what we are able to see with non-verbal communication is how they are essentially, interacting as far as or giving out signals or messages in terms of, what kind of stance they are taking. So sometimes you see this and we come across this as something called body language. And this also constitutes what is called, non-verbal communication. One of the other things, sometimes what happens is, if I have to show you a bit of a mind map, you're able to see that what we do see at some point in time is that, there are ways through which we can communicate. There are essentially, 3 ways through which we communicate. One is we speak verbally. That means we are able to speak and listen to the other individual or the person on the other side, and then able to, understand what they're saying. And that process constitutes something called communication. Sometimes we use non-verbal communication, that is the use of gestures and body language. And this is something which is highlighted on this slide, and I'm going to send this to you. It's a nice kind of a mind map, which basically explains in what situations and in under what circumstances we end up using, non-verbal communication. So things like sometimes we behave in a particular way, we make eye contact, we do some hand gestures. All the three different types. This is primarily something called, I would say, body language. This is much more to do with, you're looking at what you are looking at employing or communicating. And sometimes our behavior also can actually put across, some sort of messages as far as we are concerned when we look at communicating non-verbally. So this bit, it's a very important bit in terms of a common clip which is come across from an Eddie Murphy movie, and that clip basically shows the importance of communication. So he wanted to basically get 3 shots, or basically 3 small shots of, latte essentially, but ended up having, different things because he wasn't understood clearly, and he didn't want to speak in general, and that's the reason why he kind of used only the hand gesture oblique body language to be able to communicate. Now, for us to look at beginning this particular unit, the reason of you looking at undertaking this particular unit at level 3 is that at any given point in time when you study further, what will happen is communication in general will become quite important. And there are various ways in which you will end up studying this unit in the future. So at level 4, this might become managing communication, because once you know how to communicate, you know how to draw attention, you know how to engage your readers, or you know how to engage with the audience in general. What will tend to happen is you will move your communication skills to the next level, wherein you'll try and manage them effectively so that your message is quite clear and is effective when you're speaking or communicating something. At higher levels, in level 5 and 6, this particular unit will actually develop into more leading to essentially things like management of information, or how information is used, or how sometimes information is used via communication to be able to send messages, strategic objectives, for different types of people within the organization. A part of this will also be related to in something called human resources management. So communication is one of the key skills which is required to be had if you work within the HR department, or if you manage people, or you work as a supervisor, you have a lot of people or staff that you manage, then communication skills become quite important. So really at level 3, this particular unit is aimed at helping you develop knowledge and understanding in terms of understanding what is the role of communication, what types of communication can be had or developed, and then the different forms that we need to study, which is verbal, non-verbal, written communication, so that you clearly know in different situations or different situations that you come across, when you're working within a business or working within an organization, what you tend to then get to see is that what is the most optimum form of communication you could use to kind of, communicate or send messages across to people, colleagues, peers, and things like that. Now, this particular unit has 3 learning outcomes, and we are going to look at covering the first one today. First one is quite extensive one. It has a number of tasks, but what I've done is I've kind of structured the presentation in such a way that each of the tasks is clearly highlighted. And what I'm going to do is towards the end of the session, as always, I'm going to send you a copy of the presentation. It will be also uploaded on Moodle, and you'll also get a specific handout which I will send across, which will give you some more additional reading bits, with regards to covering all the tasks given in the learning outcome 1. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, good stuff. Any questions on this so far?
No questions so far, so it's understandable.
Okay. Good stuff. So let's look at going through some of the slides. Now, first things that I would kind of, basically come out with and ask you to think about is, what do you think is communication? How do you define communication, or what do you think is, communication in general?
Speaking to another individual.
That's correct. So yeah, in the there are various definitions that we could use to basically define this particular word, but in general, when we look at communication as a word has originated from the Latin language, and it basically means to share. So in this case, what we are looking at is the act of sharing something, or an act of speaking to someone to share a piece of information. It could be an emotion, it could be news, it could be any item or any news related item in general, would basically be whether it's happening through signs, whether it's happening through gestures, is all basically related to communication, because you are looking at sharing something with the individual that you are interacting, and that whole process will basically look at the encompass the definition of communication. So in general, it has come across from the word, a Latin word which was communicare. It basically means to share, and it is nothing but a process through which we kind of either use gestures, language, sign language, to be able to share or kind of bring out the meaning of what we are trying to communicate to the other individual. Now, going further, what we are looking at doing is, there are over the years, because it's a very vast topic and it's a very generic topic as well, what we are going to do is we're going to stick to the learning outcomes which have been described, or basically focus on the learning outcomes and the tasks which have been described in the unit specification sheet. Now, in general, as you can see, we, depending on our mood, attitude, and what we are doing, our communication seems to vary. Now, this was picked up initially by Aristotle, way back in 300 BC. Aristotle was apparently the teacher of Napoleon. So basically, what we look at was, when we looked at the whole model of the model of communication, it is something which goes as far back as 300 BC, and here, when we look at the whole aspect of the whole aspect of what you call the whole aspect of communicating something in terms of a message or anything to do with say, for example, bringing across a meaning that we want to share, what was done was that this was something which was actually picked up way back, in the 300 BC by, a Greek philosopher called Aristotle. Now here, this came across to be, the first particular model of formal recognized model of communication. So what we're going to do in the learning outcome 1 is basically look at understanding what are the different types of models of communication. But before we get into that, what I'm going to do is briefly look at highlighting what does communication include, and how does it kind of flow, or what is the process and how it is defined. Now, when we look at in general, the process of communication, we look at basically 3 or 4 things. First thing that we look at is, if I'm in this case speaking, what you do get to see is that I'm classified as something called a sender. That means from the place where the communication is actually originating. Now, what I'm speaking is basically the message. That means I'm currently delivering a particular unit and we are discussing learning outcome 1. So the bits which I'm covering either through the presentation or through the screen sharing that I've done is nothing but the message which is being communicated. And you, on the other hand, other side, are actually receiving this on your screen and able to hear. As a receiver, you are basically in that role of a receiver, wherein you are actually receiving this particular visual message which is on the screen and the audio message to the phone, and you constitute a function which basically means that you're the recipient of the message. Now, when you say yes or no, or when you nod, or when you basically respond to the communication or the message that I'm sending and you're receiving, and you say, okay, yes, I understand, and or yes, it's okay, that means you're providing a bit of feedback or some response which is actually going back to the sender to complete the circle, saying that what I've sent, what you've seen, and what you've decoded, you are able to understand, and then you put your say or yes or no to it through different ways. If you were in front of me, you might do maybe some sort of a head nod, or basically say that, okay, yes, I understand, and then that would constitute getting feedback from your end, and constitutes this feedback basically then would complete the whole process of communication. So if we break it down, we basically see there are 4 or 5 parts to the whole process, and this whole process constitutes nothing but the activity of communication. The 5th element, or we have sender, which is 1, message, which is the 2nd, receiver is the 3rd, feedback is 4th. When I say the 5th one is nothing but the use of technology here that we are doing, which basically is helping me transmit. And that technology could be the internet broadband, the Mac that I'm using, and the telephone that you're using on your side, the PC on your side, and that constitutes the element of the 5th element through which this process is getting completed. Is that okay?
Right.
Okay. Now, so in terms of when we look at the definition of communication, it also is a representation through this process which you see on the slide, and any of these elements or any of these components cannot work in work alone. So if I say something and I'm in the room, then there is nobody to respond, nobody to understand the message. Or if you're on the other side and you probably do not say, if I start speaking French and you do not understand French, then what will happen is that though you're receiving the message, but you're not able to decode it and give me feedback. So the whole process of the activity still does not get completed unless all these elements, or the elements of the process actually work in tandem or work together. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is, going forward, what I've explained is what you see on this particular slide. So the method of presenting communication process by a figure or a visual method is nothing but what I've depicted here. That is, if somebody is going to ask you, what can you draw out a communication process to me? So the communication process would consist of you drawing a sender sending a message being received by the receiver, and then a dotted line which basically gives feedback back to the sender. That would be nothing but a communication process. Now, in terms of sometimes we do see that the nature of our communication could be visual, that means you're interacting either by body language, sending out some signals, or it could be presented, or practical, that means you're speaking as well, and then you're also using the you're taking the help of some aids, which could be like technological aids, or when, say, for example, a situation is if you're attending a training, the trainer might use a microphone because there's a large audience. So in some cases, the nature of communication would need to have certain practical aids for you to be able to reach across to your audience. A television, for example, is an example of a message being received, but there are lots of elements involved in terms of practical aid being used to transmit channels, using satellites, sky, the receiver box, and things like that. We'll get into this in a bit more detail when we study the models. Sometimes you will look at elements like media, and the media element would be that you end up using clues, pictures, verbal, facial clues, and those all tend to convey the message which you are actually conveying. But sometimes you have to use a prop or a media essentially to be able to get that relevant message across. The understanding ability is nothing but how clear, how concise, and how easy is your message to understand when you're presenting it. So if I'm speaking to a set of audiences, and if I don't communicate in the same language they understand, then they might still get the message, but they might have to involve an interpreter or a person who is able to interpret the language and then kind of present it to them. So that would mean their understanding ability would vary depending on how the message is being received and to what type of audience the message is being received. So what we do is, when you look at the various models of communication, and in general, when you look at how do we communicate, your brain actually automatically picks the right channel, the right language, the right medium to communicate when you decide to send something across, say a message across. So an example here would be, if you're trying to communicate with somebody in your family, what you will get to see is that you would normally, if you're speaking to your mother or maybe your dad, might have a little bit of a polite, respectful tone. Your message would have been synthesized in your brain saying that, okay, if I'm going to ask for a favor, or if I'm going to ask for something, then I need to ask it in a particular manner. But if that same communication is going to happen with maybe your brother or your sibling or your sister at home, and if you're of the same age, your tone and the way that you kind of communicate might vary. And that would mean that when we talk, when we present, when we communicate, we tend to do this in a meaningful manner, and that meaningful manner in sometimes can be complex, sometimes requires the use of certain aids or certain other mediums through which we can present that message more effectively. Is that okay?
Right.
Now, the other bit that we will look at is, over the years, when I mentioned Aristotle, and this particular what you call different types of models of communication, this has been something which has been looked into as one of the art of one of the key aspects, or one of the arts through which when great emperors and rulers have mastered this art of communication to motivate their people to do things for them. So Aristotle was essentially he was a Greek philosopher, but the main important point is, yes, he was the teacher of the Alexander the Great, not Napoleon, sorry, my mistake. So Alexander the Great, and what he did was he came up with the first model of communication. And here we will look at a couple of models to understand how the whole process of communication has actually undergone evolution, and what is the current model which is normally used by organizations in general, people in general, is what we want to look at. So we'll start off with the oldest communication models. The work has been done over the years, the centuries, and all these models have been refined over the years, and currently we end up using either a transformational, linear, or a contemporary model. So contemporary models are more in time with modern, more in tune with the modern times. But the idea is to look at understanding some of these models. And very briefly, what we'll do is I'll give you one or two examples as we go through one of the models to understand what is the difference and why these models have evolved over the years. Because as the society has progressed, as technology has, let's put it this way, as industrial revolution came across post World War II, what we've seen is the technology has progressed, and it's not just the medium of communication, the speed and the time at which communication can be done has also changed, and that's one of the reasons why these models have evolved over the years. So the first model that we look at is basically Aristotle's model. There's a bit of a handout and a website that I will give to you for you to get more background about why these models were there. But what I've done on this on the PowerPoint slides is basically summarized the key features of the model. Now, Aristotle model basically focused on the speaker and the speech. Yeah. Now, in each of these models, we will look at the basic process of communication. That means we will reorient the same elements that we've talked about. These 4 or 5 elements that we talked about in this slide is going to be reoriented, and we will then focus on understanding what the model actually talks about. So Aristotle's model was a model of linear communication. That means straight line communication. It mainly focuses on speaker and speech. That means Aristotle, was the teacher of Alexander the Great, as I mentioned, and he mastered the art of speech. So he was able to convince people, he was able to convince armies to march with him, and he conquered the world. So he was able to do that because his communication was quite effective. He knew the art, he had mastered the art, and this particular model, when we look at, is called the Aristotle's model, because here the focus is entirely on the speaker and what he's speaking. And that is why you have these 2 terms, speaker and speech. Now, the 5 elements we talk about is, the speaker is the first element, his speech is the second most important element, the audience which receive is the third, element, the effect it has on them of the message is the fourth, but in between, the occasion at which the speaker is speaking becomes the fifth, kind of element of the whole process. So here in this particular model, because this was linear, primarily focused on what the speaker was saying, the speaker's role became the most important, and he was the only one, who was more or less predominantly involved in speaking. The others were only nodding yes or acknowledging what they were receiving as a message. Now, in this, the drawback is that the audience is passive. That means you only get to see a reaction, from the audience. You do not get to see, any feedback going into the speaker of what the speech is all about, or what the, say for example, the content of the speech or the message is about. So it is a passive model. It is primarily influenced, by the speaker. It is a one-way process. And the other thing is, because it has to be very effective, what we do get to see is a lot of people are involved in creating the message which is delivered by the speaker. So if you imagine a situation like political rallies, what you do get to see is that when politicians or when somebody is speaking at a political rally, you will see that the message, or in a speech, for example, the message is rehearsed, the message is prepared by a group of people, and the message seems to be, the most important element in that speech. So when you go across to ballroom dinners, evening dinners, which typically happen, you will see there are short speeches made by the individual, and those speeches have very little effect on the audience, apart from getting an applause or a nod saying that, yeah, that's good, yeah, and you see a bit of clapping in that. So this model is highly effective when you are looking at getting into events wherein the speaker's message is of the utmost importance. And what you will get to see is that this particular model, people who tend to be in public speaking positions tend to master this, because their speech has to have an effective delivery mechanism. It has to create an impact, or the message of the speech has to resonate with its audience in order for them to elicit any sort of reaction from the audiences who are receiving the speech. Is that okay?
Right.
Now, over the years, this model was refined into something called the Laswell's model. This is the second model that we look at. Now, because we are talking, this model was something which was a linear form of communication. This is also linear form. But here, what tends to happen is the process of communication is to benefit basically the society. So if you look at certain options wherein we talk about when we look at the the early say 18th century, 19th century, what we do get to see is that the availability of phones, there was no television, but the availability of phone, telegraph, or when actually the medium of communication was let's put it this way, only available to the elite, only available to the wealthy. This model of communication was actually created at that point in time because this spoke about this had basically this model actually provided privilege to people who were in were basically in dominant positions. So here what we do get to see is that this model has also five components, which will be the case, is again a linear model, a model of communication in which the person who's speaking is the most influential. So here the five components are kind of are divided into not the sender receiver, the feedback, and basically the process of the message, but divided into five different components, and these components basically consist of who says what, in which channel, to whom, and with what effect. So who essentially is the sender or the communicator. The say what is essentially the message which the person is speaking or the communicator is doing. The channel in which it is being communicated. So it could be, different forms. So channel here, when I talk about in the modern context, would be things like social media. It could be a television channel. It could be radio. It could be print. So these are different mediums. And to whom is basically, that means who is this intended to, is basically the receiver. And what is the effect that it has on the receiver is basically the feedback, which is basically classified in these five components. Now, these five components also look at bringing out, certain definitions in terms of what role these five components play. So the who is essentially nothing but is the person, because the person is communicating and sending out the message, is the person who is in control. He has all the power to release the information, not give out the information. That person has the control in terms of what he's trying to send across. When we look at says what is nothing but the message, and here the content analysis talks about something which is associated with what we would normally say is types of groups in which they would kind of put the message across. So here the content analysis would be that there is some sort of a motive. That means the message is designed in such a way by the speaker that it wants to have a particular ulterior motive to the message. So sometimes you see that the statements made have different connotations or different meanings, and the reason why they have the different meanings is because they are intended to confuse, or they are intended to basically send across different messages. So the content or the message is designed in such a way that different groups or different types of people or different types of groups can actually perceive that message in a different manner. Media analysis talks about the medium in which these receivers actually receive the message. So in the olden days, this model essentially talks about in the olden days when communication channels were actually privy to the rich and the famous. It's an example of a model wherein people who had televisions, for example, in the early 1960s, 1970s, they could get news quite quickly because they had the medium and the economic ability to be able to, afford a television and set. But most of the other side of people receive news maybe through the telephone or through the post. And here the analysis is that the sender is able to control the media through which the message is transmitted, so that it is received by audiences at different stages, or at different time lengths of time. Audience analysis talks about nothing but what was the target population or who was the message intended towards. And sometimes some of these messages sent across using a particular channel could be intended to reach a particular audience, and there they can be manipulated. And the last was effect, which is nothing but feedback. and this was a process which basically was looked at predicting, what would be the effect the message will have on the audience or the person who's actually receiving it. So a particular example that we get to see for this particular, what do you call, particular model, Laswell's model, would be that this model was used between the I would say 20s to the 1970s, or say the early part of 19th century. And this model was primarily used to look at mass communication. When we were looking at communicating this, sending any sort of a message to a number of audience, but the message was created in such a way that it could have a bit of an ambiguous nature to it, or it could have different meanings for different people receiving it. And here, only the rich, which had access to different forms of communication mediums, such as maybe television or radios, or say the print newspapers and things like that, could actually receive it before it went across to the masses, so that they could use it as a privilege, of, let's put it this way, as a privilege to having access to communication. Is that okay?
That's right.
Okay. Now, the next one that we look at is something which is, Warren Weaver's model. Now, this was, again, a particular model which basically, came across when over the years, the models were refined, and early in the I would say 1940s and 50s, Sharon Weaver, who's the person who actually looked at this model of communication, came across with a mathematical theory that there's a bit of mathematics involved in how communication can be done. And here, because he was, something who was associated with, let's put it this way, mathematics, he came across with this theory of communication, and he was an American, scientist. So Sharon Warren Weaver, he basically talked about that, this, when he invented or when he presented this model, he said this is the mother of all communication models, because this puts all the things in the right perspective. So here, in the 5 different components that we look at, he classified them as in different, slightly different terminology. And that terminology was that, okay, instead of the sender, there is something which is a information source. Now, the person who sends the message is not the speaker, but he basically is communicating, or is in the process of sending the message. So he's a transmitter, and that is essentially the signal. Now, through which and how it travels, whether it's going through radio waves, television, print, any other forms of mediums which are present today, that became the channel. The person who received it, and then at some stage they were not the intended recipient, but it could be, say, for example, you send a fax, and when you send a fax, it reaches the office, but the fax is meant for a particular person. So your PA or your secretary might pick it up. She might be the receiver, but the actual intended destination of that fax could be the manager or maybe the managing director, who needs to decipher that message. And in between, when it's being communicated, what you do get to see is an introduction of a new element, which is called noise. That means, because as technology in the post World War II era started to become available, what we did see was that if the message was not transmitted in a particular frequency, have you heard about Morse code?
Morse code, no, not really.
Yeah. Okay. Did you hear about telegrams? Have you heard about telegrams?
Yeah, I've heard of telegrams.
Right. So telegram was a method of sending short messages across through the use of coded languages which were transmitted across radio waves. And if this was transmitted and it landed up, say, for example, in the case of say the World War II, when this was invented, Morse code as it was called, it basically meant that the message was actually coded in a particular format, which only could be decoded if the other person on the other side receiving it knew how to put the message together. So when we look at that particular model, it basically meant that if this was being transmitted through radio waves, and if the enemy ended up receiving it and they knew how to decode the message, then that would mean that the message has been delivered, but it's gone into the wrong hand. And in order to create that kind of a divergence, that the message could not be decoded by the enemy lines, what they did was they by default created a noise, or a source code around it in a particular format it was sent, that it could only be deciphered by specific frequency or machines on the other side. And that is why there's an introduction of an element called noise. Now, simple example that I would give here is, as I'm delivering this particular lecture, what is happening is we have no disturbance in the middle, but if there is a bit of a disturbance which happen wherein we get disconnected because of the broadband speed breaking or the voice connection falling, what that will constitute is nothing but noise. That means everything was going fine, but because there's a slippage in the bandwidth which has happened, what is that done is that has distorted our communication for a little while. And once the frequency comes back again, or the Wi-Fi comes back again, what happens is the message is being we are able to transmit and communicate with each other effortlessly. But if there's a disturbance, or if there is a drop which happens of the Wi-Fi signal, that will end up creating some sort of a difficulty, and that difficulty or a barrier will be called nothing but noise. Is that okay?
That's fine, sir.
Okay. Now, very briefly going through, there are a number of slides, but the next model that we look at is, there are some advantages and disadvantages of the model. So in the case of Warren-Weaver model, there were some disadvantages. One of the disadvantage was that it applied more on, say, interpersonal communication. It did not look at, did not focus on mass communication, or when communication happens, when you want to communicate something and you want to send it across to a lot of people or a lot of audiences. And because the way feedback is structured, you do not see destination, is the last component, and we don't see any dotted lines going back to the information source. So here the main drawback was that the feedback became less important, or was not important. So it's a one-way kind of communication. That means you send a fax, the only feedback you get is the fax has been transmitted okay. But on the other side, if the paper was not there, and if the ink was finished, it prints out an empty page and you do not get any feedback. On the other side, you receive fax transmitted okay. Isn't it? Sometimes you see this, isn't it?
Yeah, you do.
So this is an example. So feedback wasn't given whether the message was transmitted okay, whether you were able to print that out, or if the paper was missing, or if the ink was not right, could you reprint that message? Was it stored in the memory? And some of these things, as you would see in the earlier fax machines, did not have an option, but then the option of having built-in memory allowed some of these faxes, or in some cases, if there was an error in receiving it, to be reprinted. And that is where feedback actually became important. So this is one of the drawbacks of this particular model when we look at the Warren-Weaver model. Now, there are lots of other models pretty much similar, but there's a bit of a reorientation in the elements. So in the SCARAMS model, what we do see is that the signal becomes the centerpiece of communication process. So here what we're talking is, what they say is the source or the sender is actually sending a message, but they encode and decode. So there are two elements which are added. So this is the message in the middle, this is the sender, and this is the receiver. But what has happened is, in the middle, they put an additional process in that when sensitive information needs to be transmitted, or when, for example, certain information which needs to be transmitted, which is only to be privy to certain types of individual, what we tend to do is we encode. That means we put some sort of a coding on the message, which can only be decoded by the person who is the intended recipient. So here, the process of encoding and decoding comes in. And a simple example which I'll give you here would be, sometimes you send files over the internet, which is emails, but you make them password protected, right? Like a price file or a profit and loss sheet. Sometimes you would see that senior management people, when they transmit certain types of information, what they will do is, in order to add an additional layer of security, they basically put a password in the file. Correct?
Right.
So the password in the file, if I'm sending you a document and this is password protected, I put in a password for me as a sender. What I'm doing is I'm the source, I'm sending you the file. I've put a bit of a mechanism on it, which is the password, to encode it. And when it reaches on the other side, what I would do is basically say, and call you up and say, okay, by the way, I've emailed you the file and it has a password for you to open, and that's the password. So even if you receive the file or if somebody else intercepts the message and receives the file, they are not able to open the document up because they don't have access to the password. So here, the message has to be of importance. The message needs to be encoded and decoded at the source and at the destination respectively. And the signal through which it is going is a signal or a medium through which it is considered, not absolutely secure. So sometimes you will see that we send across, things in the post or on the email, but we do feel that the process of communication could be compromised, and that is where we add the additional layer of security, things like password, to ensure that the person sending it, as a person like me, is only able to send it to the person and receive it on the other end, who's the intended recipient. Okay. Now there is another model called Riley's model. Now this model basically talks about having communications within groups. So imagine a situation, if you're in a room, if I'm the teacher and there are 3 or 4, there are 20 students, and what I would do is, in order to have individual conversations, I will divide you into groups, and each group will have their own communication within them. So I divide, say, 20 of you into 5 groups, and I say group A, B, C, D. So what is happening is, the group A, I've given a particular task similarly to the other groups. They are talking to each other. And when within the groups, there are communication which start with the other group. So Aman is leading one group and I'm leading the other group. But when I start speaking to Aman directly from my group, what we do get to see is there's a bit of a communication which starts to happen amongst the group and across the group. Do you get it?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so what is happening is there are parallel conversations. Sometimes when you're in a meeting room with your boss and he's called a meeting, he asks you a question, and some of us start to have our own conversations or whisper into other ears and start. So he says no parallel conversations. So what that shows is, this particular model talks about talks about the concept of that there is more than one communicator or more than one sender of the communication and more than one recipient of the information or communication which is coming in. And in order to understand this, what we do is we do have conversations in groups. And this particular model then becomes relevant when we look at a two-way communication process, wherein, as an example, the teacher would give the students a bit of an exercise. The group which finishes it first starts to have a bit of a conversation with the teacher is having it with that group, but also going around the class to monitor the other groups, to move them or have them progress to understand the task and the activity which she's asked them to do. So basically this talks about a system in which there are lots of communications which can happen, and they can happen between primary groups or secondary groups or within the group and the group members itself. So there are multiple messages being changed or exchanged, multiple feedbacks being done, and at the same point in time, if we look at this kind of a model, what we do see is this model is something which is covered under a communication model called the Riley's model. Okay.
Right.
Now the next one that we look at is Berlow's model. Now in Berlow's model of communication, what we do is we basically take into account the emotional aspect of the message. Now a simple example, the model is very similar to all the other models that we look at. Now an example is, if you have a serious bit of information, which is like, say, somebody has passed away in somebody's family and you want to communicate that information, what you would do is you would respond back or kind of offer your condolences, but you offer it in a certain manner, and this basically tends to encompass or encounter the emotional aspect of the message of the person going through that situation. Correct?
Correct.
Now sometimes in situations like happy occasions like marriages, childbirths, you basically convey your felicitations or your congratulatory message, but you do it in a particular manner, and that particular manner basically takes into account the emotional state of the receiver, isn't it?
Right. Yeah.
And a similar situation would be when you are dealing with say a sad situation or a situation which has led to a bit of loss, accident, something like that. You deliver a message, say a message of condolence in a particular manner, which is to take into account what the other person is going through or the receiver is going through. right? So this particular method of communication looks at involving the emotional aspect into the message. And here the idea is that when you communicate, when you send something across, or when you're speaking, writing, presenting something, you take into account the aspect of emotions of the person. Okay.
Right.
This particular model is predominantly used in social situations, or in situations wherein you're looking at dealing with different types of cultures, or people within different type of cultures. So when you look at a business setup, and you look at, for example, the Japanese, if you work within a company which has a Japanese culture, or a Korean culture, or a Chinese culture, or an American culture, you see a different way of doing things. So in the Korean and the Japanese culture, what they do is, when they tend to greet people in the room, they tend to bend and kind of offer their let's put it this way: instead of shaking hand, they will bend and show respect when they are greeting guests or people coming in, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
So this kind of a model basically looks at that kind of incorporation of cultural as well as social messages, in order to adapt to the emotions of the recipients. Okay. Now, the last model that we will look at is contemporary model. Now, in the contemporary model, this is the model that we use on a day-to-day basis. This is the modern evolved form of communication, and an amalgamation of some of the best aspects of different models that we've looked at. Now, here in this particular model, you will see more elements, but the elements predominantly consist of ensuring the process consists in terms of ensuring that the message is communicated well, is received well, and is understood the first time it is sent. So here we look at communicator. The person might encode, because we are using modern technology to send messages like emails, telephones. So what will happen is, if I'm sending an email, the email goes across an Hotmail. For example, the message, it has maybe a congratulatory message on your promotion. The person who receives it on the other end can receive it on the mobile phone, tablet, for example, a PC. When he receives it, he has to open. So if I've sent you a mail from Hotmail, you need to have something as a software to be able to open it. You just can't open it without the software, or a mail reading software. So that bit includes decoding, and it's only the intended recipient who's receiving. So if I'm sending something across to Aman Qasim, you have only received that invite to be able to join the session, nobody else. And that information is privy only to you. And because you've accepted the invite, we get a feedback coming back saying that the person has accepted the invitation today. That means the session will happen, isn't it? So this is the modern model which is evolved, and we end up using the contemporary model of communication on a day-to-day basis in our day-to-day lives. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is, Aman, I'm going to kind of maybe stop here, because we had a bit of a teething issues in the beginning, but I'm going to try and stop here, and I'm going to send this across to you, this presentation, and also a bit of a handout, just to make you aware of the different types of communication. Right? We've only discussed verbal communication as of now, which is using these different models we've understood in the background. But what we want to do now is, in the next few slides, I'm going to try and talk about something called written communication, verbal communication advantages, disadvantages, which I've done while explaining the models, and to a certain extent visual communication. Okay. And then we talk about electronic communication, the modern form of communication using fax, phone, social media, and things like that. And then what is the difference? There's another way of classifying communication into a process called formal and informal. So sometimes you get to hear the word that, the dress code for the party is formal dressing. That means suit and tie, black suit and tie event. Sometimes they say, okay, it's a black suit and tie event. Similarly, when you write or when you communicate, sometimes you're very formal in your tone. Sometimes you're very formal in your writing. And that is another form in which we basically can kind of, distinguish that these are different types of communications that we can do. So formal means, you're looking at officially writing a letter to your GP, or writing to your council, and you're basically doing it formally. Informally would mean it's mostly to do with, if, for example, if you want to invite some of your friends to your birthday party, you might send out informal greetings. You might meet them at the workplace and say, okay, let's get together, and go out to the pub or have a few drinks after the day, after the day's work, because I'm looking at, spending a bit of time and celebrating my birthday. But in the case of your boss, or in the case of if you're inviting certain senior people that you do not work with on a day in, day out basis, what you might do is maybe send out a message through email, or maybe drop them a formal invitation. And that would mean that if you want them to come in and participate or be a part of that occasion, you will send something across in a more formal manner. So we tend to then basically look at, differentiating this in the form of something called, formal and informal communication. And that's something which has been summarized here in the slide. The other few bits that we look at is basically understanding how communication can be made effective. Now here, there is something called the 7C model of communication. And this 7C model of communication talks about why we need to have these 7Cs so that our communication can be, clear, crystal, precise, effective, and could be understood positively by the person on the other side. And the reverse side would be to look at barriers to effective communications. If I'm trying to send something across, and I want people to understand that message clearly, there are a lot of things which cause the word noise that we used is nothing but a barrier. Sometimes you send something across, say, for example, you said, I've transferred the money to the bank, but you don't end up receiving, say, for example, you don't end up receiving the money in 2 hours. So what you do is you call up the bank and you find out why the transaction has not happened, and you find out, okay, there was this reason or that reason, and that reason seems to be something which is nothing but constituting a barrier. So similarly, in the case of communication, when we do see barriers which kind of, restrict the message to go across in a very effective manner, and that is what we will look at is called barriers of effective communication. So a bit of reading, and then what I want to do is wanted to look at a particular situation and understand which particular model of communication would you apply in a situation like this. So these 2 slides I put in towards the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this across to you. We've covered the majority and the most important part in terms of the process of communication, and how what are the various models of communication, and in what situation those models are used, and what is the most up-to-date current model of communication that we use in modern day-to-day life. Okay, and then the idea would be, when I send this to you, have a read through some of the slides, specifically the written form of communication, along with this handout which I'm going to send, which I'm showing, and that focuses on communication which is written, communication which is verbal, and communication which basically involves different types of formal communication, things like sending a formal email, sending a formal a letter or a statement of purpose, and it'll give you some idea in terms of why this is done and how this can be done. In specifically in the case of business situations, why do we pick and choose a form of method, whether it's written, verbal, formal, informal, the way different types of classification that we do? Why do we pick and choose a particular method to be able to do this? Is because you want the message to have an impact. You want the message that you're transmitting or sending across to have a particular reaction, and for which you choose an appropriate medium to communicate. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I'm going to stop here and send you this as I mentioned, and then we'll do a bit of a recap before we do the next session next week, same time. And the idea would be to email me any questions or any queries that you have. So what I'll do is I will be able to provide you some more details for you to be able to address the tasks in the unit specification which are there.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Was the subject okay? Were you able to understand it okay?
Yes, sir. You explained it, but yeah, it was easy to understand.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to try and send you one or two small links of videos which you can watch on YouTube as well, basically looking at verbal communication, non-verbal communication, and written communication, which are short videos that you could look at. And if you require, it'll give you a bit of more. Sometimes when they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, if you watch that video, what it'll do is it'll explain you the whole process of why this is done, and then to back it up, you could read some of these slides in the handouts that I sent you. Okay, brilliant. Thanks a lot for this, Qasim. I'll catch up with you next week then.
Thank you very much.
Okay, take care. Thank you. Bye. Bye for now.
Bye.